Hello everyone and welcome to the What Have You Done YouTube channel. In today's episode we are going over some very disturbing stories about night. So without further ado, let's go forward with the video. And remember, if you see something, my friends and I may have just encountered a skinwalker. My friends, Teja, May, and I were outside smoking a blunt down the street next to a field with a bunch of bushes nearby, and my friends saw a rat and started running away. I looked at the rat and sighed, turning back to the girls, and I told them to stop being a bunch of pussies. Then they came back and finished the blunt after a few minutes. The rat had gone into the bushes by now, and there was a fence right behind the bushes. Then I heard the noise, a loud slam against the fence, and did the worst thing, and checked what it was. Then we heard another loud slam against the fence, and now we were scared shitless. I know damn well a rat couldn't hit the fence that hard. So we just ran away, and then as we were running away, there was a very broken howl behind us. I can't describe it too well, but it sounded like the animal had lost its voice and was also doing drugs at the same time. We ran back inside, caught our breath, and then we sat in May's room and started watching TV and eating ice cream to calm down. 35-ish minutes later, we heard a howling right outside May's window and a tapping. Now we're hiding in her basement. Wasn't exactly sure what to do. I just got worried and wanted people to know this before I potentially die.
There's this place called Swanson Field. I haven't been out there in forever. The time I went there to shoot this footage, the footage you're seeing right now, this is the first time I've gone out there in years. But I've probably driven past the place 1,000 times. People say that the place is haunted. Personally, I don't believe in ghosts, but it's got enough folks spooked to catch my attention. There's none of the regular sorts of paranormal activities or places mulling about. No old Victorian houses with dark paint jobs, no abandoned tuberculosis hospitals or mental asylums. It's just a field. The only reason I even know about the place is because we used to go there out on Halloween. It's funny that I'm only remembering it now as I'm saying this out loud, but all the kids at school would spend the day before Halloween. They used to call it Mischief Day, making masks and getting ready for the walk through Swanson Field. We didn't go trick-or-treating on people's doors. We would all go out, either with our moms or dads, or sometimes both, and we'd walk through the field. It was a big deal that our parents didn't look down at the kids. They never looked us in the eyes while we walked across the field. I remember looking over at the other kids' parents and seeing how they pestered their moms and dads, each and every one of them. And it must sound strange to you to hear this out loud right now, but back then it was just normal to us. We were just kids. Our parents brought us out there from school until after it got dark on Halloween night. Other than that one night, Halloween night, like I said, kids were never allowed to go out on Swanson Field. There was another thing too. You weren't allowed to take off your mask until the grown-ups said you could. We actually spent a lot of time in school making them, and the teacher always made sure that they had this weird sort of diamond, star figure on them, right on the forehead. It always ruined my masks. I spent a lot of time on mine, and I always thought that it made it look lame. More like something you'd, get at a town fair or some cheap shop. There was always these other people who moved out in the woods, away from the field. They were people, but they never looked like people. They didn't move like grown-ups did either. They moved like deer. They sort of swooped up and down, fluid, like in the way they ducked between the shadows and the trees, but they walked on two legs. They had great costumes. Funny thing, now that I think about it, I can never remember how all that Halloween stuff actually ended. I bet I just fell asleep and my mom and dad had to carry me back to the car. And then nobody would ever bring up Swanson Field. Grown-ups would actually get mad if you talked about the ghosts of kids standing out in the grass. And hell, I can even remember a kid getting sent to the principal's office just for drawing that weird little thing that they put in everybody's masks. I remember even then thinking that how stupid that was. I mean, if they hated the thing so much, then why do they make us wear it? And then, every year, without fail, our teachers would tell us a story about the field a couple of days before Christmas. Whenever the sun would set really, really, really early in the day, the teacher would tell us a weird old story about how the people could hear children's voices out there. I don't know why they did this. I'm sure none of the other schools in the other towns did it. Thinking back now, I spent half the time thinking about just watching the clock and waiting to see when I'd get back on the bus. Probably more focused on how there was going to be no homework because we were so close to the end of the break. The teacher would always say that Swanson Field was a special place, but that you should never go there alone. And now, I've never really thought about how strange it is that they wait until some day in the winter to bring it up again. And I can still remember getting onto the bus and forgetting the whole thing and getting back home just thinking about what I wanted for Christmas. And this is the first time that I've been back on Swanson Field ever since. I mean, I don't hear anything. Do you?
Silence. Silence was uncomfortable, and Amy didn't like it. Fingers nimbly tap-tapped across black and white keys as she typed up what she hoped would be a phenomenal English essay. She rubbed her tired eyes and sighed, straining to see what she had just typed in the dim light provided by her laptop. The numbers at the bottom of her laptop monitor read 11:37 p.m. It was going to be a long night. She turned to reach for her headphones, and then paused. The laptop allowed her to view what she was typing, but it did nothing to assist her in banishing the inky blackness that met her eyes as she turned away from her laptop screen. It unnerved her as her fingers scrabbled around for the earbuds she had so carelessly tossed away earlier on the bed. Turning back to her laptop with earbuds in hand, Amy breathed hard and then chastised herself for being so childish. She was already 16. She was old enough to know there was absolutely nothing to be worried about. Yet, now that she had seen how completely something could cloak itself in the darkness, Amy couldn't seem to shake the feeling that something was watching her. She attempted to continue on typing normalcy when something like footfalls behind her sounded. Amy froze. She could hear her parents snoring in the bedroom across the hall from her, and her sisters had long since fallen asleep. Amy turned stiffly, terrified to think what would be behind her. Every single monster she had ever read about or seen in a horror movie came to her mind all at once as she finally looked upon the spot where the footfalls had sounded. Nothing. Amy hesitantly got up out of her chair, still not completely convinced that she was alone in her room. She practically sprinted for her door and hastily flicked the light switch on. Warily, Amy skirted her room with her eyes, positive that she would find something ghastly grinning at her from a corner, from her mirror, or from under her bed. Nothing. Amy released a breath she wasn't aware she had been holding. She left the light on and padded back to her laptop, plugging in her earbuds. Quickly, the pounding beat of her music flooded her ears, and Amy returned to the rhythmic typing of her essay. She was almost done with her third paragraph when she looked at her clock again. The time read 11:52 p.m. Amy paused her music for a moment to rest and realized how deafening the silence was. Her music acted as a mask that temporarily cloaked to the unnerving feeling of not hearing anything but one's own breathing. With horror, Amy thought of how something could have skittered, crawled, or slithered into her room without her hearing it over the volume of her music. She hastily whipped her head towards her door again, and as she did so, she felt the gossamer touch of something ever so slightly brushing her shoulder. Barely stifling a shriek, Amy looked back at her shoulder, expecting to see dead, rotting fingers gripping her tightly. It was just her blonde ponytail resting on her shoulder from when she'd whipped it around so quickly. Amy rubbed her temples and sighed. Maybe she should get a haircut. The silence and her own exhaustion was getting to her. She was imagining things. This couldn't be healthy. Not even bothering to care about quality anymore, Amy typed several humdrum sentences and concluded her essay. Tentatively, Amy looked behind her one more time. Nothing. Being alone was scary when it was quiet, Amy mused warily to herself when she crawled into bed. But in the end, it was nothing but childish paranoia. Amy let herself drift off to sleep, feeling safe and content, curled up in her blankets. She never noticed the dead, rotting hands that quietly prized open her closet door, nor the Glasgow smile that shone through the darkness as Amy's monster watched her with wide, unblinking eyes and began thinking of ideas of how to play with her tomorrow night.
Once upon a time, more than a century ago, there was a man who made his living off the sea. He was an ample fisherman for a man of his age, and eventually became first mate on a merchant marine ship. He was a quiet man who kept mostly to himself, but there was something very peculiar about him that only came up when a ship reached shore. Unlike most sailors of his time who could think of nothing but how to enjoy their time and spend their money once on shore leave, he wanted to have nothing to do with it. He would sometimes not even leave the ship until one summer he caught fever due to dehydration and malnourishment. The doctor of the small New England town where his ship was docked diagnosed that he needed to spend more time on dry land, and from that point on, he could not hope for a moment's peace from his crewmates until he submitted to their wishes and went on shore. He was a good man, and his fellow sailors, whom he was always very good to, simply wanted to make sure that their friend remained healthy and well. And so it was that the seafarer joined his friends and mates and took to drinking. And it was only when drunk enough, for he could far outdrink any of his comrades, that his peculiarity came into full form. The seafarer described how he hated to walk on the face of the earth, hated to feel the touch of soil underneath his feet, hated to know that if he slept on a bed that stood firmly on a foundation made by his fellow man, he could not sleep that night. He claimed that whenever on land, he could hear the sounds of all those his family had wronged calling up to him, threatening to bring him down into the ground with them. He said that the longer he stayed on land, the louder and clearer the voices became, and that ever since he was 17, he had not spent more than a single night of sleep on dry land. He would then, often with great reluctance, describe how his family had made their fortune in the slave trade, and that he found this practice, despite bringing his mother and father great inheritance before their deaths, was abhorrent to him, and that the haunting voices he heard in both sleep and waking hours filled him with dread that he feared there was no solution to. While the seafarer was a good man to his crewmates, he was not entirely honest. For it was not his family who were to blame for the abominations of the slave trade, but he himself who had committed such atrocities against his fellow man. Before becoming a fisherman in Yarmouthport, he was a particularly wealthy slave trader. He was particularly good at delivering before schedule and in excess of his estimations, and he made a great many men wealthy outside of his own personal fortune. He was so good at his trade that he became particularly thrifty, so as to ensure the optimum revenue that he left on one voyage so ill-stocked that after only a few days after leaving the Ivory Coast, he had barely enough supplies to sustain his crew and himself. He fooled himself into thinking that the long weeks back to New England would be sufficed by the nourishments of the attempts of fishing for his crew, and the ample supply of rats in the underbelly of the ship for his cargo. But after 7 straight days of not a single fish caught, not a rat or any beast of any manner in sight, the seafarer came to a decision that no decent human would ever dare. Every captive bound for New England was thrown off his ship, weighed down together, weighed down in chains, and the only thing that he could think about was the money. Money was something that he lost. As a matter of fact, his atrocious act cost him so many thousands of dollars that after arriving to shore and informing his investors of nothing, he took out as much of his own capital as his banks would allow in a single day's transaction, changed his name, and began a new life. He was not sure how many years after his horrific acts that the voices began to seep into his dreams, but once they were there, he was all too sure of where they came from. None of his former life ever came up in his interactions with his captains and crews, and other than night terrors that no one could resolve, which always and only occurred during shore leave, he led a seemingly honest life. The seafarer eventually retired after achieving a captain's post when he became simply too old to fulfill his duties on the open seas. Being wealthy enough, he began the construction of a home that kept him, quite literally, on the sea. He kept mostly to himself, just as he had in his younger days, but he was often prone to finding his way to the local tavern and telling his audience, his particularly unwilling audience, all about the voices that were calling him down into the earth. On one particularly stormy night in 1888, he was forcibly removed from the tavern after his ramblings went from vague premonitions, heard by few and far between, to loud outbursts of the imminent, coupled with the destruction of property, and the desperate plea for anyone to bring him out to sea to avoid what he felt was, merely hours away, the inevitable. As the storm raged so strong, the only thing crazier than his ramblings of the underground dead was the notion of bringing him, or anyone for that matter, out of the harbor and into the open, thrashing waters. The seafarer left the tavern that night and disappeared into the snowfall, not to be heard from again that night. After the storm, a good and decent neighbor decided to stop by his home and see how he had fared the weather. The door was unlocked. Actually, it was open, and after letting himself in, calling out the name of the old captain, who was, by this point, quite hard of hearing, he came to a disturbing discovery in the basement. Beneath the house in the sea lay a single human hand, sticking straight out of the damp, peat moss floor of the room, clutching at what appeared to be nothing. The men of the town had to dig more than 6 feet down to excavate the rest of the seafarer's body, which after excavation showed one arm outstretched much farther than the other up towards the surface, and one leg that descended more than a foot below the other. It was not until springtime, when the seas had calmed and the soil had warmed, that a thorough investigation was conducted. The purpose for such an investigation was that more than 6 feet beneath the basement of the seafarer, far too deep and wet and cold to be dug out in the middle of the winter, were the bones of a hand that seemed to be clutching at his ankle. It was not until that spring that the bodies of more than 50 human beings were exhumed beneath the basement of the ocean home, with remnants of shackles identified as iron still keeping them chained together. None of the bodies found in the basement were ever identified other than the seafarers.
Well, that was the scariest night stories, or at least disturbing night stories of 2023. Once again, I want to thank everyone for watching, and if you enjoyed this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like the video. I mean, if you made it to this part, you clearly like it, so why not? Also, comment your thoughts. What you think was the scariest, and what exactly was the best and worst story in your opinion? So, yeah, I hope you would like that. On top of that, I want to thank Dalena Nguyen and Asriel Werikai for helping me out with this. And yeah, as I said before, if you see something, just remember,